The bank sent another notice. Red sticker. Bright white envelope. 32 days. 32 days until they started the paperwork. Until May and Leo, until everything. 2 months' worth of payments, stacked on top of the medical bills, on top of the loan I'd taken out to keep the business afloat after the fall. It felt like building a tower of debt, each brick a fresh humiliation. That's why I was here. Not for the ocean or the camaraderie, or because I suddenly developed a passion for lubricating pumps. It was the money. $2,200 a week after taxes. Enough to stop the bleeding. Maybe. Enough to buy some time. The rig smelled like diesel and salt, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old pennies and ozone. It wasn't a bad smell, exactly. Just pervasive. The steel grated under my boots as I followed Harvey, the foreman, through a labyrinth of pipes and walkways. Everything was painted a dull, industrial gray. The Gulf was a flat, steely mirror surrounding us, the horizon blurred by haze. It was loud, too. Not a crashing, violent noise, but a constant thrumming, a low vibration that settled in your teeth. Harvey pointed out the galley, the sleeping quarters, tiny, windowless cubes in the floor, which was where I'd be spending my 12-hour shifts. It was a vast, open space filled with monitors, gauges, and a bewildering array of valves and switches. He handed me a work vest, a hard hat, and a tablet. "Sign here, and initial by the safety briefing. And read this," he said, tapping the screen. "It's just the standard stuff, rules. Don't want anyone getting hurt or, causing problems." The standard stuff turned out to be anything but. It was a text document clearly copied and pasted a dozen times, with a line at the bottom. "Please read carefully. Compliance is mandatory." I scrolled through it while Harvey disappeared, muttering something about a stuck pump. 1. Do not touch the glass of any window, mirror, or reflective surface after 2 a.m. If a surface has a handprint already on it that you didn't make, cover it. Okay, that was strange. Superstitious, maybe? Old sailor's lore? I pictured some bored deckhand concocting this stuff to mess with the new recruits. 2. After 2 a.m., ride the elevator facing away from the doors. Do not turn around until the doors open at your floor. Seriously? That felt actively dangerous, like inviting someone to sneak up behind you. But, fine, I'd just look at the floor numbers. 3. If a colleague begins repeatedly asking about your family, do not engage. Report immediately. That one gave me a genuine chill. Not because it was scary, but because it felt invasive, like a violation of some unspoken boundary. Still, probably just covering themselves legally. Someone had a bad experience, and now it was in the handbook. 4. Do not stop moving in the main floor control room. Pass through, do not linger. Just keep walking? That seemed inconvenient. I could see myself getting yelled at for blocking a walkway. 5. If a room that should be empty is locked from the inside, do not attempt to open it. Mark the door and note the time. Come back at the end of the shift. If still locked, report and do not investigate. That was the most reasonable one so far. Common sense, really. Probably some old storage room that someone had gotten locked in once. 6. If you hear a rhythmic knocking sound coming from the pipe network, do not investigate. Leave the area immediately. Rhythmic knocking? What even? I snorted, a little laugh escaping me. This place was a magnet for eccentrics, clearly. 7. Always count the stairs when using the east stairwell. If the count differs from the last time, do not proceed. Return the way you came. Now they were just messing with people. 8. Before turning any corner in Section C, knock twice on the wall and wait 3 seconds before proceeding. Okay, that was starting to feel less like a joke and more like passive-aggressive micromanagement. 9. Do not bring cut flowers, potted plants, or fresh produce into the mess hall. Sealed, packaged food is acceptable. What? Food restrictions? What did flowers have to do with anything? 10. Do not ask what happened to Yates. If a coworker brings it up, change the subject. Yates. Well, that was unsettling. That one didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a warning. I reread the list, shaking my head. It was absurd, a bizarre collection of anxieties and prohibitions. Probably just a way to weed out the weak, I figured, to see who could follow arbitrary rules without question. I needed this job. I couldn't afford to get bogged down in superstition. I saved the document to my tablet and tucked the device into my vest pocket. Harvey reappeared, looking hurried. "All right, rookie, let's get you oriented." The shift started slowly, mostly monitoring gauges, checking pressure readings, making notes. The thrum of the machinery was hypnotic, almost soothing, but I kept glancing at my watch, waiting for 2 a.m. to roll around. It was almost midnight now. I found myself unconsciously avoiding the windows, not because of the rule, but because the dark reflection of the control room looked wrong, distorted, like looking at a photograph slightly out of focus. I told myself it was the fatigue, the stress, the weight of those red stickers pressing down on me. I needed to focus on the job. I needed to keep my head down and get through this. I was on rounds checking the emergency lighting along Sector C. It wasn't glamorous, just walking a concrete corridor with a clipboard, making sure the backup bulbs hadn't burned out. The corridor was warm, not stifling, but definitely warmer than the control room. The air smelled like oil and something else, metallic, but not like blood, more like the inside of a battery. The lights hummed, a low, consistent thrum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. It was quiet, thankfully. Kit had been trying to teach me some of the jargon, but he talked fast, and I was still struggling to remember what a doghouse was supposed to be. I just nodded and pretended to understand, hoping he wouldn't ask me to explain it back. The emergency lights were mostly fine. A couple needed replacing, which I noted on the clipboard. It was tedious work, but better than staring at the pressure gauges, better than thinking. Thinking about the house, about May's medical bills that kept arriving even after everything, thinking about Leo and Iris. I hadn't been able to call them properly yet. The signal was spotty out here. Just a quick text to Sarah saying everything was okay, that I was safe. A lie, probably. Safe didn't feel like the right word. I reached the end of the corridor near the outer hull. There was a small square window there, looking out onto nothing. Just blackness and the occasional flicker of a distant light. It wasn't a viewing window exactly, more of a structural feature, reinforced glass I'd gathered. Harvey had mentioned something about it being designed to withstand a certain amount of pressure. I glanced at it as I passed, noting a smudge on the glass. Probably just grease. Then I stopped. It wasn't grease, it was a handprint. A clear, distinct handprint, pressed against the inside of the glass, facing in. That didn't make any sense. That window faced a solid wall on the other side. There was no way anyone could have reached it from the inside. No access panel, no maintenance shaft, nothing. It was just a wall. I stared at the handprint, my stomach twisting. It was unsettling. I remembered the list. The ridiculous, paranoid list. Something about reflective surfaces after a certain hour. I couldn't recall the exact wording. Something about not touching them, about marks appearing. Honestly, I dismissed most of it as the ramblings of some overcautious safety inspector. Probably a former engineer with too much time on his hands. But the image of that handprint, pressed against the glass from nowhere, stuck in my mind. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself. A reflection of something else. A smudge that looked like a hand. I reached out, intending to wipe it away. To prove to myself it was nothing. My fingertips were inches from the glass when a high-pitched whine cut through the hum of the machinery. It wasn't an alarm, more like feedback, a piercing electronic shriek that made my teeth ache. It lasted only 1 second, but it was enough. I stopped. My hand hovered in the air. The sound, however brief, had jolted me. It felt wrong to touch it now. I could feel a prickle on the back of my neck. Instead of wiping it, I fumbled in my vest pocket for a piece of the packing paper from my lunch. It was greasy from the sandwich, but it would have to do. I carefully pressed the paper against the handprint, covering it completely. The paper stuck, leaving a slightly uneven patch. It looked even stranger now, a blank space where a phantom hand had been. I quickly finished my inspection, practically running back to the control room. I didn't look back at the window. I didn't want to see if the handprint was still there, lurking beneath the paper. The whine hadn't repeated. Everything was back to the normal, monotonous hum. But it wasn't normal anymore. Not for me. I logged the light replacements, barely registering Kit's greeting. I kept glancing at my hands. They felt sticky. I scrubbed them under the water tap in the small washroom, but the feeling remained, a faint phantom residue. I kept thinking about that handprint, pressed against the glass from nowhere, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I wouldn't be able to forget it. I needed a strong coffee, and maybe a long, hard conversation with Harvey about what the hell was going on out here. I was inventorying the drill bits in Sector 4. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. Most of the night shift guys avoided Sector 4 unless they had to be there. Something about the layout, I guess. Too many dead ends, too much echoing. It suited me fine. I needed to focus. I needed to get my head straight. The handprint, I kept replaying it. Stupid, I told myself. Just a trick of the light. A smudge. Probably someone messing around, finding a way to stick something to the glass and then disappearing before anyone noticed. It was a practical joke gone wrong, or a maintenance worker with a weird sense of humor. That had to be it. The bits were organized alphabetically. Thankfully, Harvey always said a good floor hand was an organized floor hand. I was trying to be a good floor hand. A good everything, really? A good provider. A good father. I pulled a box of 7/8" polycrystalline diamond compact bits, checking the quantity against the manifest. 12, correct? I made a small tick mark on the clipboard. It was a small victory, but I needed them. Every little thing felt like a tiny weight lifted. I was on the last row when I heard the chime. The elevator chime. Odd. It wasn't scheduled to run for another 40 minutes. No one had requested a pickup on the radio. I glanced towards the elevator shaft opening, a dark rectangle in the corrugated metal wall. It was probably just a glitch, a phantom signal. The rig was old. Everything was prone to glitches. Then the doors opened. Not at the Sector 4 landing. They opened, fully and silently, halfway down the shaft, between floors, just hanging there, open to nothing. And then I remembered the list, the rules. I couldn't recall the number, but the image of the text was vivid enough. Something about the elevator. After 10 p.m., something about facing away from the doors, about not looking. It was 11:17 p.m. I froze. My hand, still holding the clipboard, tightened until my knuckles were white. It was irrational, of course. The elevator was just malfunctioning. A broken cable, a sensor error. But the memory of that handprint, the lingering stickiness on my skin, the unnerving whine, it all coalesced into a single overwhelming urge, an urge to obey. Without thinking, I turned my back to the elevator. Completely. I focused on the drill bits, on the chipped paint of the storage rack, on anything but the dark opening in the wall. I could hear a faint whirring sound, the mechanism of the elevator adjusting. It was slow, almost hesitant. The air grew colder. A damp chill settled on my skin, raising gooseflesh on my arms. I held my breath. The whirring stopped. A pause. A long, drawn-out silence that felt like it stretched on for minutes. Then, a soft click, the sound of the doors beginning to close. And then, the chime again. This time, it was at the Sector 4 landing. The elevator doors slid open in front of me. I didn't turn around immediately. I waited. I counted to 5. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my trembling hands. The rule. I'd followed the rule. I hadn't looked. Finally, I turned. The elevator car was empty. Perfectly, clinically empty. But the smell? It was subtle, almost undetectable, like wet concrete. And something else, something organic, like overripe fruit, but not quite. And there on the floor of the elevator was a single dark feather. Not a bird feather. It was too thick, too coarse. It looked almost mammalian. I stared at the feather, my mouth dry. The smell intensified, clinging to the back of my throat. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a joke. It was something else entirely, and I had just given it permission to arrive. I didn't touch the feather. I didn't even breathe in too deeply. I stepped out of the elevator, my legs feeling heavy and unsteady. I finished the inventory, mechanically ticking off the remaining items on the manifest. My hand wouldn't stop twitching. I didn't look at the elevator again. I needed to get back to the control room. I needed to tell Harvey, but I knew somehow that telling him wouldn't make it better. It wouldn't explain the smell, or the feather, or the sickening feeling that something had been delivered. I just wanted to finish my shift, to go home, to see my kids, but now even that felt tainted, like I was carrying something back with me, something I couldn't see. I was calibrating the flow meters in Sector 2. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. The metal walkways were cool under my boots, a welcome change from the humid heat of the control room. Each meter had a small glass face, and I was methodically checking the readings against the master log, jotting down discrepancies with a grease pencil. Kit was supposed to be doing a pressure check on the same line, but he hadn't shown. I didn't think much of it at first. Kit was Kit, always drifting, always a few minutes behind. The air smelled like oil and something vaguely antiseptic, like a dentist's office. The low thrum of the machinery was a constant companion, a sort of white noise that usually faded into the background. I focused on the numbers, on the precise movements of the needle, trying to block out the unsettling feeling from the elevator. The feather, the smell. I told myself it was just fatigue. Long hours, bad coffee, the constant vibration of the rig. My mind was playing tricks. I needed to sleep and get home. I finished with the first bank of meters, moved to the next. That's when I noticed it. Kit. He was leaning against the pipe run, staring at a weld, not looking at it, staring, unblinking. His head was tilted at a strange angle, and he was humming, a single sustained note, low, almost a drone. It wasn't a song. It wasn't even a tune. Just one unbroken note. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the humming itself. It was the way he was humming. The stillness, the focus, and that stare. Like he was trying to burn a hole through the metal. I paused, pencil hovering over the log. Maybe he was just lost in thought. Maybe he'd hit his head. Kit wasn't exactly known for his spatial awareness. I tried to tell myself that. I really did. But the sound, it resonated in my teeth. It felt wrong. Then, a flicker of something in the back of my mind. A half-remembered phrase. Something from that ridiculous safety manual. About behavior. About not engaging. About reporting. A rule. The edges were fuzzy, but the sense of urgency was sharp. Something about a colleague. Something about compromise. I didn't think. I just reacted. I turned and walked away from Kit. I didn't go back to the meters, didn't even glance over my shoulder. I walked quickly, deliberately, towards the nearest access corridor, towards Sector 3. Every step felt heavy, deliberate. I could still hear the humming, faint but persistent, following me down the hall. As I rounded the corner, I risked a quick look back. Kit hadn't moved, still leaning, still staring, still humming that single unbroken note. He hadn't acknowledged me. He hadn't even blinked. I found Harvey in the galley, brewing a fresh pot of coffee. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, not in detail, just that Kit was acting strangely, that I felt uneasy, that I thought he needed to be checked on. Harvey grunted, said he'd send someone. He didn't ask for specifics. He didn't seem particularly concerned. I finished calibrating the flow meters in silence, the humming echoing in my ears. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but the image of Kit, frozen in that bizarre pose, was burned into my mind. I tried to rationalize it. A migraine? A reaction to something in the air? But the rule that half-remembered warning, it wouldn't let me rest. The smell of overripe fruit, faint but persistent, clung to the back of my throat. It was different than the smell on the elevator, but similar, like they were both pieces of the same puzzle. When my shift ended, Harvey was waiting by the chopper pad. He said Kit had been sent to the infirmary for a routine evaluation. He wouldn't say anything more. I didn't ask. The chopper lifted off, carrying me away from the rig, away from the humming, away from the unsettling silence. As the platform receded into the darkness, I found myself clutching the letters I'd written to my kids. I hadn't been able to bring myself to seal them. They lay open in my lap, the words blurring in the dim cabin light. I kept glancing at my hands, expecting to find a stain, a residue, something that would explain the lingering sense of dread. But there was nothing, just the faint scent of oil and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The coffee tasted like burnt plastic, even with the sugar. I'd brought a thermos from home, a stupid attempt to hold on to something normal, but it leaked in my bag, and everything smelled faintly of it. I was tasked with inventory in the warehouse bay, a mess of pipes, couplings, valves, and God knows what else, stacked haphazardly in metal cages. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and after the kit thing, quiet felt like a blessing. The bay was enormous. Easily the largest single room on the rig. Everything echoed the clatter of my clipboard against the metal shelving, the distant thrum of the generators, even my own breathing. I was working my way down one of the central aisles, scanning barcodes, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to shift with every flicker of the overhead lights. It was almost 2 a.m. My shift was dragging. I kept thinking about the letters, still hadn't sealed them. I'd picture Leo, age 8, ripping them open, and Maisie, age 5, needing help sounding out the words. It felt pathetic, carrying around unsent letters, like I was holding onto a ghost of a normal life. I needed to get them in the post. Everything felt precarious enough as it was. I had to stop and check a particularly large shipment of flanges. They were new, still wrapped in plastic, and the barcodes were smudged. I knelt down, fiddling with the scanner, trying to get a clean read. The scanner beeped erratically, then died. Completely. No lights, no sound, just a dead weight in my hand. "Great," I muttered under my breath. I hadn't even thought to pack extra batteries. The thought of walking all the way back to the supply room, clear across the rig, was exhausting. It felt exposed. I glanced up instinctively. The aisle stretched out before me, a long tunnel of stacked metal, and then behind me, the same, no one in sight. I stood up slowly, turning in a circle, trying to get my bearings. The warehouse bay was designed to maximize space, which meant minimal obstructions. You could see almost everything from the center, and right now I felt like I was everything. Everything visible. I remembered something, a fragment of the orientation manual, something about staying in motion, in certain areas, large areas. It wasn't a clear rule, just a warning, almost. Something about drawing attention, about visibility. It felt distant, imprecise, probably just safety protocol. They didn't want people standing around in the middle of the aisle, blocking access. That made sense. It was just common sense. My radio crackled to life, then died again, static. I jiggled the antenna, pressed the talk button. Nothing. I hadn't realized how reliant I'd become on that thing. It wasn't just communication. It was a reassurance, a tether to something. I took a step forward, then another. I needed to get to the supply room. I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild. Kit was in the infirmary, probably just dehydrated. The humming was probably just the ventilation system. The scanner was just a dead battery. And this feeling, this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, was just exhaustion. But my feet felt leaden. I'd been standing there fiddling with the radio for longer than I thought. A full minute, maybe more. A long time to be perfectly still in the middle of that vast open space. I imagined eyes on me even though I knew it was irrational. Even though I knew I was alone. I started walking faster, almost breaking into a jog. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I just kept moving, putting distance between myself and the spot where I'd stopped. I passed the first few rows of cages, the metal cool and smooth against my arm as I brushed past. When I reached the edge of the warehouse bay, near the loading docks, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I leaned against a stack of pipes, my heart finally starting to slow. I fished my phone out of my pocket, checked the time, 2:17 a.m. I still hadn't sealed the letters. I pulled a small, waterproof bag from my pocket and carefully placed the scanner inside. I'd deal with it later. I needed to get back to work. The flow meters wouldn't calibrate themselves, but I realized, with a jolt, that I hadn't even glanced back at the center of the bay. I hadn't wanted to see if anything had shifted, and that, I knew, wasn't normal. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't imagination. I started walking towards Sector 2, my steps measured, deliberate. I had a feeling I wouldn't be forgetting the feeling of being watched anytime soon. I just hoped, desperately, that it wouldn't follow me out of the warehouse. I was sorting through the replacement valves, checking the serial numbers against the manifest. Old stock mostly. Some of these things had been sitting in crates for years, probably. The air in Sector 3 was different than the bay. Less open, more metallic, even though there was just as much steel around. It smelled like old oil and dust motes, a dry, clinging scent. I had to keep wiping my glasses. The manifest was a mess. Handwritten and crossed out. Numbers smudged with grease. Harvey was supposed to have digitized this thing months ago. Harvey always had good intentions. He just didn't. I was starting to resent Harvey. It wasn't a strong resentment, more like a low-grade irritation that settled in my shoulders. I made a note to mention it to Arlen during breakfast. Maybe Arlen could light a fire under him. I was on valve 347 when I saw it, a small storage room tucked away in the back corner of Sector 3. It was used for spare wiring, junction boxes, that kind of thing. I hadn't paid it much attention before, but the door was closed and it was definitely locked. That wasn't unusual. We locked everything up tight at night, but something about this felt off. I tried the handle. A reflex locked. I leaned closer, squinting. No sign of forced entry, no scratches around the keyhole, but the lock wasn't the kind we typically used. It was an older model, a heavy brass mortise lock, the kind you'd find on a shed, and it was locked from the inside. I paused. That wasn't right. That room shouldn't have been locked from the inside. No one went in there after the evening check. It was just a storage space. Probably someone forgot to unlock it. A practical joke Kit, maybe, before he got sick. Though Kit didn't strike me as the joking type. I fished my radio out of my pocket, pressed the talk button. Still nothing. Just static. I sighed. I probably should have reported it immediately, but I had a backlog of valves to inventory, and I didn't want to interrupt Yates. He was already in a foul mood about the coffee machine being broken. It could wait. It probably was nothing. But the image of that lock kept nagging at me. I remembered something. A fragment of the orientation document I'd skimmed through on my first day. Something about rooms and locks. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but it was something about not forcing entry if a room was locked from the inside. Something about leaving it alone. A feeling of consequence. I tried to dismiss it. It was just a safety regulation, a way to prevent accidents. If someone was inside, they'd be trapped. It was the logical explanation, but the lock, that antiquated brass thing, it didn't fit. I pulled a roll of fluorescent orange tape from my belt and wrapped it tightly around the doorknob, marking it clearly. Then, with a small grease pencil, I wrote the time on the tape, 11:02 p.m. It felt ridiculous, like I was participating in some bizarre, bureaucratic exercise. I glanced at my watch. 11:03. I needed to finish the valve inventory. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I finished the valves, filed the report, and tried to get some sleep in my bunk. I dreamed about numbers and rust, about locked doors. When my alarm went off at 6, I felt groggy and vaguely unsettled. I made a quick cup of instant coffee and headed back to Sector 3. I had to finish the inventory log before Yates came looking for it. I walked quickly, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. I found the storage room exactly as I'd left it. The orange tape still bright against the dull metal of the doorknob. I approached cautiously, expecting to find the lock still engaged. It wasn't. The door swung open with a soft click, revealing the small, cramped space inside. It was exactly as I remembered it. Shelves stacked with rolls of wire, boxes of connectors, a few stray tools lying on the floor. Nothing out of place, nothing missing. But the lock, the heavy brass mortise lock, was now unlocked, hanging loose from the doorframe. I stood there for a long moment staring at the open door, the unlocked lock. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool metal of the handle. There was no sign of anyone having been inside. No footprints, no disturbed dust, no explanation. I checked my watch. 6:08 a.m. I pulled out my inventory log and dutifully marked the room as checked. Door unlocked. No anomalies. I didn't write previously locked from inside. I didn't want to write it. I needed to get back to work. I had to get through the day. I had to make sure the flow meters were calibrated. I had to remember to mail those letters tonight, even if it meant staying up late. But I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my stomach, that something had changed. Something was different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that whatever had been inside that room, whatever had locked that door, was now somewhere else, waiting, and I hadn't even looked for it. The inventory was mostly straightforward. Bolts, flanges, couplings, all neatly organized on pallets, labeled with those yellow tags that always seemed to rip the second you tried to read them. I was working the south aisle, section Delta 9, trying to get a count on the different sizes of steel cable clamps. Tedious work, but it was a quiet corner of the warehouse, and quiet was good. I'd already had enough of Kit's presence for one shift. He was still on days, thankfully, but I kept catching him out of the corner of my eye, just watching things, not looking at them, just watching, like he was waiting for them to move. The air down here was different too. Not bad, just thick. The usual scent of oil and metal was overlaid with something else, something almost sweet, like overripe fruit, maybe. I couldn't place it, probably just the ventilation system or something. This place was a labyrinth, built and rebuilt over decades. You were bound to get weird pockets of air. I checked the temperature gauge on my wristband. 72 degrees, perfectly normal. I was stacking the inventory sheets, trying to keep them organized as I went. When I heard it, a sound. Distant, muffled. At first I thought it was the wind, whistling through the ventilation shafts, but it wasn't the wind. It sounded like someone calling for help. A woman's voice, I thought. Faint, but definitely a voice. Help, please. My hand froze over the inventory sheets. I glanced around the aisle. Nothing. Just rows and rows of neatly stacked metal. Harvey had mentioned something about sound traveling strangely in this part of the warehouse, bouncing off the metal walls. Probably just an echo, or someone on the radio. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Help me please, someone. It was definitely coming from deeper in the warehouse, towards the loading docks. I started walking, slowly at first, just to get a better sense of the direction. The voice sounded strained, panicked, like she was in trouble. I figured someone must have tripped, maybe hurt themselves. This place was a hazard, with all the equipment and uneven flooring. I picked up my pace, rounding a stack of pipe fittings. The voice was louder now, more urgent. Help! I'm stuck. I was almost to the end of the aisle, where it opened up towards the loading bay, when something caught my eye. A reflection in the polished chrome of a large valve housing. It wasn't my reflection, it was just a flicker, a momentary distortion in the metal. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light or fatigue. I hadn't been sleeping well since the cancer diagnosis worsened. I was running on fumes. But it felt like something had registered, a tiny pressure behind my eyes. Then, another sound. Not the voice, but a scraping, dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the concrete floor. It was coming from the same direction as the voice. I started to move faster, almost breaking into a run. And then, a fragment of something I'd read, something buried in the safety manual, surfaced in my mind. Something about sounds, not investigating, just leaving. It wasn't a complete thought, just a feeling, a warning. Something about not going towards the sound, especially if it sounded like someone in distress. I couldn't recall the exact wording. I remembered the red warning symbol, a crossed-out ear, something about lures. I stopped, dead. The voice was right there now, almost within reach. Help me, please, I'm trapped. The scraping sound was louder, closer. It sounded like metal on concrete. I took a step back, then another. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. I felt a strange tingling sensation in my hands, like pins and needles. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like wrongness, a deep, visceral sense that something was fundamentally out of place. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I just walked, steadily back the way I came, away from the voice, away from the scraping sound. It felt like wading through thick mud. Each step required a conscious effort. The voice followed me, growing fainter as I retreated. "Help, please, someone." I kept walking, focusing on the yellow tags on the pallets, on the concrete floor, on anything but the sound. I reached the halfway point of the aisle, then the three-quarter mark. The voice was barely audible now, a distant whisper. Finally, I reached the beginning of the aisle, the point where I'd first heard the sound. I paused, listening. Silence. The sweet, cloying smell was still there, but fainter. I checked the temperature gauge again. 72 degrees. Still normal, but my hands were slick with sweat and the tingling sensation hadn't gone away. It had spread up my arms, into my shoulders. I marked my inventory sheet with a check mark for Delta 9 and moved on to the next section. I didn't report the sound. What would I even say? I thought I heard someone calling for help, but then I remembered a vaguely recalled safety protocol and decided to ignore it. They'd think I was losing it. But I knew, with a growing certainty, that I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening on this rig, something I didn't understand, and whatever it was drawn to sound, to distress, and I had just barely managed to avoid walking straight into it. The feeling of wrongness lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. I had a sudden, irrational urge to count the rivets on the nearest steel beam, just to anchor myself to something solid, something real. I didn't, but I wanted to. The inventory report for Sector 4 was a mess. Someone, probably Harvey, had scribbled numbers over each other with a grease pencil, making half of it illegible. I sat at the folding table in the mess hall, nursing a lukewarm coffee and trying to decipher his handwriting. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant irritating drone. It was almost 2 a.m. The rig was quiet, save for the hum and the occasional thrum of machinery, deep within the structure. I'd skipped dinner, figuring I could grab something later, but now my stomach was starting to complain. I went over the numbers again, comparing them to the digital manifest on my tablet. 32 spools of cable, type Delta 7. Harvey had written 35. I sighed. This was why I hated inventory. It wasn't the work, exactly. It was the sheer incompetence of everyone else. If I just fudged it, no one would notice. It was a few spools of cable. It wasn't like anyone was going to build a spaceship with it. But my head swam with the image of foreclosure notices. Every single detail had to be exact. My wife, Sarah, would kill me if I messed this up. She'd already sacrificed so much. I circled Harvey's number and wrote verify in the margin. That meant a trip down to Sector 4, to the storage bay, and a lot of walking. I finished my coffee, the grounds gritty at the bottom of the cup. I really needed to get a new thermos. The stairwell down to the lower levels was just off the mess hall. It was a narrow metal construction, spiraling down into the guts of the rig. I hadn't used it in a few days, preferring the elevator when I could. But the elevator was out of service for maintenance, and I wasn't waiting for it to be fixed. I started down, taking the steps 2 at a time. It was then I remembered the directive. Something about counting the stairs in that specific stairwell. I couldn't remember exactly what the document said, just a vague sense of unease. Something about things changing. It felt ridiculous, honestly. A waste of time. Probably some overzealous safety regulation dreamed up by someone who'd never spent a day on an oil rig. But I figured, what was the harm? I stopped at the bottom of the first flight, pausing to catch my breath. 21 steps, I counted them again. Just to be sure, 21. I continued down, focusing on the task. 32, 33, 34. I mentally recited the numbers as I descended, trying to block out the hum of the rig, the tightness in my chest. I reached the bottom of the second flight. I took a deep breath and started counting. 1, 2, 3. I lost track somewhere around 10. Annoyed with myself, I went back to the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 12, 13, 14. And then I stopped. something felt wrong. I glanced back up the stairs, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. It wasn't a visual thing, not exactly. It was a sense of disorientation, like the space had shifted somehow. I counted again, slowly, deliberately. 1, 2, 3, 17, 17. That wasn't right. I was certain there were more than 17 steps on that flight. I retraced my steps, counting upwards this time. 1, 2, 3, 20. 20 steps. I blinked. 20. The last time I'd used this stairwell, I remembered clearly. There were 18. I convinced myself I was tired, that my brain was playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd miscounted before. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Maybe the coffee was stale. But then I looked up and saw that the landing above wasn't where it should be. It wasn't positioned directly above the bottommost stair. It was offset, slightly to the left. The metal railing didn't line up with the corresponding railing on the previous flight. Everything was subtly, sickeningly wrong. I froze. The directive, the vague, unsettling warning, it all came rushing back. I hadn't paid enough attention. I'd dismissed it as nonsense. Now I was standing in a stairwell that wasn't quite right, a stairwell that had changed. I didn't dare move. I slowly, carefully turned around and began to climb back up. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, each one felt heavier than the last. I focused on the metal under my boots, on the cold, smooth texture of the railing. I counted each step, obsessively, desperately trying to anchor myself to reality. 20 steps up, then 17, then 20 again. The landing above didn't return to normal. It stayed offset, distorted. The space felt thin, like a membrane stretched too tight. I reached the top of the stairwell and stumbled out into the mess hall, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light. I didn't report the discrepancy. Who would believe me? Hey, I counted the stairs and they were wrong, so I came back. They'd send me to the medic. I just wanted to finish my inventory and get back to my bunk. But as I walked back toward the folding table, I noticed something else. The smell. It was faint, but it was there. That sweet, cloying odor that I'd smelled in Sector 4, near where I'd heard the voice. It was clinging to my clothes, to my skin, and it was getting stronger. It wasn't just on me. It was in the air in the mess hall. I was stacking pallets of sealant in Sector 7, trying to get the inventory numbers to match the manifest. It was tedious work. Each pallet had 3 different types of sealant, each in 6 different sized containers. The manifest listed everything by container size and batch number. It was the kind of thing designed to make a man question his life choices. The air in Sector 7 was thick with the chemical smell, even with the ventilation running full blast. It wasn't the same smell as the one from the stairwell, though. That one was sweet. This was acrid, burning the back of my throat. I was trying to remember if I'd left the burner on under the coffee pot this morning. Probably. I always forgot. Sarah would be furious. Not about the coffee, exactly. More about the potential for burning the house down. She'd been extra tense lately, even with the treatments going well. The bills were piling up, the bank was calling, and the foreclosure notice was still taped to the fridge. I needed to get through this shift, get through the next few shifts, and maybe, just maybe, start digging myself out of this hole. I'd managed to get 3 pallets stacked neatly when Yates walked by, looking harried. He was the foreman for this section. Caius, you seen Kit? I need him to sign off on the valve inspection in Beta 9. Haven't seen him since breakfast, Yates? I said, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. He was quiet, just staring into his oatmeal. Yates grunted. That's Kit. All right. Well, if you see him, tell him I need him, and try to get those pallets organized. Yeah, we got a shipment coming in tomorrow. I nodded, watching him hurry off. The smell was getting to me. It wasn't just burning my throat now, it was making my eyes water. I pulled my bandana up over my nose and mouth, which helped a little. I needed a break. I needed air. I needed to call Sarah, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I had at least a few more pallets stacked. I turned to grab another pallet, and that's when I saw it. The hallway, the one that led to the break room and the restrooms. It wasn't right. The angle felt off. And that's when it hit me. A flash of something I'd read in the safety manual. Something about corners, about signaling your presence. It was buried in a section about emergency procedures, about what to do if there was a breach. I'd skimmed it, dismissed it as overcautious nonsense. Knock twice. Wait 3 seconds. Before turning any corner. I paused, my hand hovering over the edge of the pallet. It was ridiculous, of course. Some bureaucratic hoop-jumping exercise designed to make people feel safer. But the scent was stronger now, and the feeling of being watched, it was almost palpable. My stomach clenched. I wasn't usually a superstitious man. I was a construction worker, a small business owner, a husband trying to keep his family afloat. I dealt in concrete, in steel, in measurable things. But something about this place. I reached out and knocked on the wall twice, sharply. 1, 2. I counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It was just a rule, a silly rule. Then I turned the corner. And there was something there. Not a person, not an object, just something. It was a shape, indistinct and shifting, partially obscured by a stack of discarded wiring reels. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to waver, like heat rising off asphalt. It wasn't fully in the space, like it was bleeding in from somewhere else. I couldn't make out any details. I didn't want to make out any details. I froze. My jaw locked. My teeth ached. It was the same feeling I'd had in the stairwell. The space around me compressing. The air growing thin, but amplified. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I didn't make a sound. I stared straight ahead, focusing on a chipped paint spot on the far wall. I slowly, carefully, began to back away. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, keeping my eyes fixed on that paint spot, refusing to acknowledge what was in my peripheral vision. The shape didn't move. It didn't react. It just was. I backed around the corner, heart thumping a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I stopped, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The hallway was empty. Just the usual clutter of toolboxes and spare parts. The scent was fainter here, but still present. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. I just stood there, for a long time, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the wiring reels. But I knew with a sickening certainty that it hadn't been, and that the simple act of knocking, of following that ridiculous rule, had been the only thing that had kept me from. What? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. I took a shaky breath and started stacking pallets again. But the sealant containers felt slick in my hands, and the smell of chemicals seemed to cling to me, suffocating. I glanced at the hallway, then quickly looked away. I knew, with a dread that settled deep in my bones, that I would be knocking before every corner from now on. I was supposed to be checking the fire suppression system in Sector Delta. Just walking the line, making sure the nozzles weren't clogged, the gauges were in the green. Tedious work, but better than inventory. At least it got me moving. My knees had been aching since that fall on the access ladder last week. A stupid, clumsy mistake. I should have been paying attention. The air in Delta was thick with the smell of lubricant and something faintly metallic, like old pennies, but not quite. It clung to the back of my throat. The fluorescent lights hummed, a constant, irritating drone. I checked the first 10 nozzles, scribbling the serial numbers into my tablet. The metal was cold under my gloves. It was quiet, too quiet, even for Delta. Usually you could hear the pumps running somewhere in the background, a low thrum that vibrated through the deck plates. Today, nothing. I walked further in, past the rows of stacked pipe joints. The space opened up, a wider corridor leading to the emergency exit. That's when I saw them. A bunch of sunflowers crammed into a repurposed oil can, sitting on top of a control panel, bright yellow, ridiculously cheerful. Opal had brought them. She'd been talking about her garden all week, how it was the only thing keeping her sane. She was new, hadn't even been on the rig a month. She seemed like a nice enough woman, always offering to share her thermos of chamomile tea. I stared at the flowers. They didn't belong. Not here. Everything on the rig had a purpose, a designation, a place in the inventory. Sunflowers were just wrong. I almost dismissed it. Flowers. What was the big deal? Opal was probably just trying to brighten things up. It was a long stretch. This job, a little bit of color couldn't hurt. But then a phrase drifted up from somewhere deep inside my head, something about organic matter. A restriction, a warning. It wasn't clear, just a fragmented feeling of unease. Something about not bringing life into certain areas. It seemed ridiculous, of course. Superstitious nonsense. Probably just some old safety regulation no one bothered to update. Still, the image of that handprint on the inside of the window flashed in my mind. That hadn't been rational. I glanced around, trying to gauge how long I'd been standing there. Too long, I could feel my pulse quickening. The silence felt heavier now, pressing in on me. I picked up the oil can, careful not to damage the blooms. They felt strangely substantial, heavier than they should be. "Those are nice," I said, turning to address the empty corridor, a habit, I suppose. The corner announcement rule had gotten to me. I still felt compelled to announce my presence, even when there was no one to announce it to. I carried the flowers out of Sector Delta, back towards the mess hall. Opal was in there, making coffee. She saw me and smiled. "Aren't they lovely?" she said, her voice a little too bright. "Harvey brought me some cuttings from his place. Said they needed a bit of sunshine." "They're great," I said, placing the oil can on a nearby table, as far from the food preparation area as possible. "Just thought they might be better off somewhere else, more light." She frowned. "Oh, are they in the way?" No, it's just they might attract bugs in here. Don't want to contaminate the food." It was a weak excuse, and we both knew it. Opal's eyes narrowed. "Bugs? It's a steel box in the middle of the ocean. Caius, there aren't exactly swarms of insects buzzing around." "Just being cautious," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. I busied myself with my coffee, stirring it unnecessarily. You know, safety first. She watched me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You seem on edge," she said finally. "Everything all right?" "Just tired," I said quickly. "Long shift." She didn't say anything else, but she kept looking at me. It made my skin crawl. I finished my coffee and headed back to Sector Delta, needing to get back to the fire suppression system, needing to get away from Opal's stare. The silence in Delta was even more pronounced now. The metallic smell had intensified, and I could have sworn I detected something else underneath it. Something sweet, rotting. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Exhaustion. That's all it was. I continued checking the nozzles, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to the sunflowers, to Opal's questioning look, to that fragmented memory of a rule I couldn't quite grasp. I finished the line, signed off on the inspection, and started heading back towards the main corridor. As I passed the emergency exit, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A single sunflower petal lying on the deck plate, yellow, vibrant, and utterly out of place. I knelt down and picked it up. It felt cold and strangely brittle in my fingers. It wasn't just a petal, it was dry, like it had been there for days. But I just walked through here. I just carried the flowers from here. And the silence wasn't empty anymore. There was a faint, rhythmic clicking sound coming from somewhere deeper within Sector Delta. A slow, deliberate clicking, like something counting. I turned and walked back towards the mess hall, needing to find Kit. I needed to ask him if he'd noticed anything strange. I needed to ask him about the humming. I needed to ask him something, anything, to break the mounting dread that was settling over me. But I knew, even as I walked, that he wouldn't be able to help. Kit never helped. He just watched and hummed. I was checking the emergency lighting in the galley, just walking the line, noting bulb outages, making sure the backup generators would kick in without fail. Tedious work, but someone had to do it, and honestly, it was a welcome distraction. A small pocket of normalcy in a place that felt increasingly off. I'd been through here twice already today, but the shift foreman, Yates, wanted a double check after that near miss with the power surge last night. The galley was mostly empty, just a lingering smell of burnt coffee and stale grease. Kit was at one of the tables, meticulously cleaning a wrench. He hadn't said a word since I'd passed him on the way in, just continued polishing that wrench like it was a sacred object. I tried not to look at him. The humming hadn't started up again, which was something, I guess. I focused on the flickering, fluorescent tubes overhead, making a mental list of which ones needed replacing. I was halfway down the line, noting a particularly bad flicker near the sink, when I heard Arlen's voice. He was leaning against the doorway, nursing a mug. He looked tired, older than his 40-something years. He caught my eye and gave a small, weary smile. "Rough night, huh?" he said. "You could say that." I kept my hand moving, checking the fixtures. "Anything interesting happen on your watch?" He hesitated, taking a long sip from his mug. "Well, it's just old man Tiberius, the guy before me in this position. Silas, they called him. He disappeared, about a year ago, right around now, actually." A knot tightened in my stomach. I knew I should just ignore it, walk away. But Arlen looked like he needed to talk, and I was, against my better judgment, curious. "Disappeared how?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Arlen lowered his voice, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Nobody knows, one shift. He was here. The next, gone, vanished. They searched the rig top to bottom, even sent divers down to check the hull. Nothing, just gone. Folks say he was getting jumpy leading up to it. Kept talking about things he'd seen, things he'd heard, shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, said the rig wasn't right. Then one morning, nothing." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "They say he spent a lot of time in the old radio room, trying to reach someone on the mainland. Said he needed to warn them about something." I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. My palms were sweating. The lights above seemed to pulse a little faster. It was just a story, I told myself. A sad story about a lonely old man who'd gone a little crazy out here. This place did things to people. The isolation, the endless gray, the constant drone of the machinery. It could drive anyone around the bend. That's all it was. But then I remembered something. A fleeting impression. A half-remembered phrase when I read through that safety manual. Something about not asking. Not asking about what happened before. About the ones who came before. The manual warned against it. Vaguely. Something about disturbing. Something. "Look," I said, my voice sounding tighter than I intended. "I gotta finish this check. Yates is breathing down my neck." Arlen blinked, looking momentarily surprised. "Oh, sure, of course." He seemed relieved, actually. "Didn't mean to bother you." I turned away, forcing myself to focus on the emergency lights. I needed to get this done. I needed to get away from Arlen and his story. I needed to pretend I hadn't heard a single word. But the radio room, the old radio room. It was right next to the galley, tucked away at the end of a narrow corridor. I hadn't even noticed it before, and I suddenly desperately needed to know if it was still locked, if anything had been left behind, if there was any clue as to what happened to Silas. I knew I shouldn't. I remembered that feeling, that fragment of a rule. Don't ask, don't inquire, don't disturb. But the thought of Silas alone and afraid haunted me. The need to know was overwhelming. I finished the line of lights, signed off on the section, and then, against every fiber of my being, I started walking towards the corridor, towards the radio room. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. It hadn't been like this earlier. I was certain. I pushed it open further, revealing a small, dusty room filled with antiquated equipment. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and decay. The radio itself was a massive, archaic contraption, covered in dials and switches. A thick layer of dust coated everything, but it wasn't the equipment that caught my eye. It was the logbook lying open on the table. The last entry was dated October 27th of last year. Silas's handwriting, shaky and erratic. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I needed to see what he'd written, what he'd been so desperate to warn everyone about. And then I remembered the rule, the warning. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the logbook. I knew I shouldn't read it. I knew it would be a mistake, but the curiosity was too strong. The need to know was too overwhelming. I told myself I'd just glance at the last entry. Just one quick look. But as I reached down, a new sound cut through the silence. A slow, deliberate scraping from somewhere deep within the rig. A sound that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was coming from Sector Alpha, the sector I was supposed to be inspecting in 15 minutes. I froze, my hand still outstretched. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that if I stayed here, if I read that logbook, whatever was making that sound would find me, and I remembered the sound rule. Don't investigate. Don't linger. Retreat. I snatched my hand back from the logbook, turned on my heel, and ran. I ran as fast as I could, back towards the galley, back towards the relative safety of the main corridor. I didn't look back. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd already made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Because the scraping sound hadn't stopped. It had gotten closer, and now I could hear something else. A faint, rhythmic clicking like something counting. Just like in Sector Delta. And I knew with a growing sense of dread that I'd left the logbook open, and everything I hadn't dared to ask about would now be repeated. The chopper blades were a dull ache in my teeth even after we touched down on the mainland. I hadn't realized how much I'd been holding my breath on that rig. It wasn't relief I felt. Exactly. More like emptiness. Like a pressure valve had been released, but nothing had actually changed. I didn't speak to Kid on the flight out. He just sat there, staring at the back of the seat in front of him, humming that same damn note. Low and continuous. It didn't even sound like a tune anymore. Just a vibration in the air. I kept my eyes fixed on the churning water below, trying to convince myself the whole thing had been stress. Sleep deprivation, the constant thrum of the machinery getting to me. A bad run of luck. That's all it was, a series of unfortunate coincidences. I needed to focus on getting home, on seeing the kids, on figuring out how to explain another 2 weeks away. The smell lingered, though. That cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic. It wasn't strong, not anymore, but it was there, clinging to my clothes, to my skin. I tried to scrub it off in the airport bathroom, using half a bottle of that industrial-strength soap, but it didn't budge. I told myself it was the disinfectant they used on the rig. A strong, lingering scent, just a smell. Irene met me at the airport, her face tight with worry. She didn't ask where I'd been, not at first. She just hugged me, a quick, brittle hug, and then started talking about school plays and doctor's appointments. I let her talk, nodding and offering the occasional grateful for the normalcy. I didn't tell her about the logbook, or the stairwell, or the shape I'd seen in Sector Gamma. It would sound like I was losing it, and maybe I was. The house felt wrong. Not damaged, not dirty, just off. Like something had shifted while I was gone. I walked through the rooms, touching things, trying to reassert my presence. The kids were ecstatic to see me, of course. Leo, my youngest, just wanted to show me his latest Lego creation. Maya, older and more reserved, gave me a cautious hug and then retreated to her room. It felt good. It felt almost right. But I kept catching myself staring at the windows, at the reflections, not looking for anything, just checking, making sure the glass was clear, making sure there weren't any smudges, any marks on the inside. It was a strange compulsion, and I didn't understand where it came from. I'd find myself pausing, mid-conversation, just to glance at a window, then quickly look away, embarrassed. I tried to get back into the rhythm of things, fixing the leaky faucet, helping Maya with her homework, reading Leo a bedtime story. But the edges of everything felt blurred. I'd be halfway through a sentence and lose my train of thought. I'd start a task and then wander off, distracted by a sudden, inexplicable feeling of unease. The foreclosure papers were still on the kitchen table, a grim reminder of the reason I'd taken that job in the first place. I stared at them for a long time, the weight of my debts pressing down on me. I'd earned enough to buy us some time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I started writing the kids' letters again, like I used to. Long, rambling letters filled with mundane details about my day. But I couldn't bring myself to write about the rig. I couldn't bring myself to write about the things I'd seen, the things I'd heard, the things I'd felt. It felt like inviting them into something dark and dangerous, something I couldn't protect them from. I applied for other jobs, of course. Construction work, mostly, but my old injury flared up with even the smallest exertion. The doctor said I needed to take it easy. Rest. Physical therapy. Things I couldn't afford. Tonight, I was getting the kids settled. Leo was already asleep. Maya was lost in a book. I was checking the locks on the back door, making sure everything was secure. It's a habit I've always had, but it feels different now, more thorough. I paused at the kitchen window, the light from the porch illuminating the glass. And I did it, without thinking, without even realizing I was doing it. I ran my fingertips along the inside of the glass, tracing the edges of the frame. Just checking, making sure there's nothing there. Just ensuring the surface is clean.